Hey, how's it going? So in this video, I'm actually back home where I grew up. This is where I grew up. And I'm back here, and since I'm back here, I thought I'd talk about what it was like growing up in Hawaii. I think a lot of people in Hawaii, when they think back to what it was like to grow up here, can kind of look back at their childhood and have a similar sort of just sense of awe and wonder. Even though I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, I still think that there's a lot of experiences that a lot of other people can relate to, even if you grew up years before me or some years after. Because growing up in Hawaii is such a privilege, whether or not you realize it as you're growing up or maybe many years later. It's really a privilege, and I use that word deliberately. And if you grew up in Hawaii, let me know how you thought it was to grow up in Hawaii in the comments below. Okay, and by the way, this was my room right here. All right, sorry, I really wanted to show my room, but my mom said cannot. So just know that the room is behind me, and right now my camera is sitting on a bunch of canned pineapples, some books, and a folding chair box. But this room definitely brings back a lot of memories. I think one of the cornerstones of growing up in Hawaii is how close you actually are with your immediate family and your extended family. It's a very important aspect of local culture. And thanks to Lilo and Stitch, we now associate family with ohana, as in no one gets left behind. But when you grow up in Hawaii, ohana or family is more than just people not being left behind. So starting with my immediate family, my core support and foundation, I grew up in a family with two working parents, so they were obviously pretty busy, but they always seemed to make time for me and my brother. Back in high school, I played sports, and my parents came to every single game. I mean, some of the games I didn't even suit up and play. And of course they were there when I did actually play, but there were a lot of games where they just showed up. I really like how our family has aged and transitioned from when we were like little kids to now both me and my brother are grown adults. Our relationship has grown beyond just parent-child. And I remember we were talking about this one night where my dad was saying that we're kind of no longer parent-child, even though we are their kids, my parents' kids. It's a lot more than that now, because it's almost as if we're kind of like adult peers and we can talk about certain things. It's just nice to be able to have that relationship with your parents, just being able to talk to them like normal adults. I think that's a really great transition from how our relationship used to be as a parent and child. All right, trying to change up the angles here without showing too much of the room. But I really think that Hawaii is known for the closeness among the extended family, particularly aunties, uncles, cousins, and especially grandparents. We were really close to our grandparents on my mom's side, and they would watch us a lot, especially when we were a lot younger kids. But even like as we got older, we used to spend summers there and winter break there. And I remember we'd go to their house for like family dinner. Sometimes it felt like 3 or 4 times a week, but definitely pretty much every weekend. But we did spend a lot of time together. And I think that's the reason why, even though they both died 20 years ago, I still think about them every single day. And it's because I miss them. And I wish that they could see how we all turned out. Wish I could meet my son. And what I miss about them the most is that at my grandma's house or grandparents' house, they used to host our family get-togethers. It was usually the bigger holidays, a lot of the major holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's, Super Bowl, things like that. But they were the one place where our entire family would come, and they were just that gathering place. And maybe that's something that you can relate to, where you had one relative's house where everyone would just kind of go there, and that's where they would celebrate. I think back to all the birthdays that we spent with dobash cake and ice cream, or New Year's Eve, we play fireworks until who knows when. And of course we have our annual Christmas party where we eat plenty of food and play bingo. And that's where our extended family grew close together, because that's where I spent a lot of my time with my cousins and getting to know them. By the way, I remember this fridge, our old fridge, it broke one night, and we had all this food and we had to get the food into something or else it would all go to waste. And I remember that was such a mess, but yeah, that's what this fridge is about. And one last thing about family closeness. I hope that in all the business of today, that my generation, our generation in 30s, 40s or younger, I hope that we don't forget to pay back what the Kupuna did, what the older generation did for us, because we really do owe them quite a bit, whether or not we realize it. Because they made so many sacrifices for generations that they didn't even know yet. And I hope that they know that when it's time for us to be taking care of them, that they can count on us. For some people, it may seem kind of humbug, right? Like, you don't want to do that. Like, you're so busy, you got your own stuff going, but it's important to really remember that we're supposed to be there to take care of them. At least that's how I was raised. And I know that's how I'm raised because that's what my mom has demonstrated for us to learn from. I mean, she's taking care of not just my grandma, grandparents, but also some aunties and uncles. And that type of sacrifice, that type of going the extra mile to take care of them when maybe they can't take care of themselves, I think that really demonstrates the family closeness. I mean, it's real great when you go out and, you know, grandma, grandpa, or auntie, uncle pays for all the dinners of everyone and you take the big group photo, and, you know, that's real nice. But I think that it goes beyond just thanking them for, you know, buying stuff or paying for things. I really think that to show the family closeness, it's more than just family dinners and get-togethers. It really comes down to a lot of those private moments, those moments that really no one's gonna see, that you're not really gonna see on social media. And watching my mom do that right now demonstrates for me what I'm expected to do and what I want to do when it's time for me to help them out. And so I just hope that our generation doesn't forget about that. Ah, yes, the laundry room. And the second thing about growing up in Hawaii is that I think we're relatively poor, or at least just kind of a lower quality of life. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone who grew up in Hawaii was poor. I mean, there are definitely some families who are well off. But looking back, we didn't always have the nicest things, and mostly it was because we just didn't really know any better. I mean, back then when I would watch TV and I'd see the houses and people on the mainland through television, I used to wonder, how do they live in such a big place and they'd be able to go to restaurants or amusement parks that we just never had here? And so yeah, people in Hawaii don't typically grow up in a lot of these big spacious areas. If you visit a lot of the traditional Hawaii homes here, they're 3-bedroom, 2-bath, single walled, pretty small, versus your mainland homes, which are, you know, usually 2 stories with maybe a basement and a pretty big garage, big yard, just generally more space. But the thing is, when you grow up in Hawaii, that's kind of how it is for everyone. But I think what's hard now is with the internet and just being exposed and being more interconnected globally, we can see what other people have and they can kind of see what we have. And now there's more comparison. Now we have a sense more of the things that we lack than maybe things that we think we should own. And so we go out and we fill our houses with those things, and oftentimes we fill them so much that they're often stored in places like the garage or even extra storage. But what was nice about growing up in Hawaii, even if you didn't have a lot of money, was the fact that you could just go outside and just do things that were relatively free or cheap. You can go to the beach and swim. That's pretty free. You can go outside, play at the park. Also pretty free. You can go ride your bikes or go play basketball or just throw the football around. Just something. Most of those things are pretty free. So in other words, back then in Hawaii, it felt like fun was cheap, or at least cheaper. Say hello to our little lizard friend. And the last thing I want to talk about growing up in Hawaii is just being exposed to so many different cultures. And it's more than just growing up with a lot of different groups, but really you're able to identify your own cultural identity. I mean, yeah, Hawaii has a lot of different cultures, but when you grow up here, culture or ethnicity, it just doesn't seem to be as divisive. I mean, it does matter in a lot of different ways, but it's not as divisive as on places like the mainland. I remember growing up in school and I recognized that some of the kids looked different than me, or their last names were of a different ethnicity, but it just didn't really seem to matter. I mean, when I was in elementary school, my best friend was African American. I didn't see him as African American, he was just my friend. And the girls that I liked in school, I didn't like them because they were Japanese or Asian, because that was me. I just liked them because thought they were cute and interesting. There's this great book called Under the Blood Red Sun that I read back in 6th grade, but also reread for my YouTube channel. And it's about a family growing up in Hawaii during the attack on Pearl Harbor. And it centers around this Japanese family. And while it's great that it's this sort of historical fiction of that attack and of that event, it really highlighted the racial relationships between a lot of the different groups in Hawaii, because I really enjoyed how the main character, who was Japanese American, got along with his friends who were Caucasian or Filipino or all these different groups, Hawaiian. And that was me. That was my experience growing up, where it didn't really matter so much. We were just all friends. And I think this really prepared me for my time in Colorado away. I mean, imagine local boy, and for the first time at the age of 18, I realized that not everyone looks like me, that I was actually the minority, and I stood out quite a bit. But the thing is, I never let that bother me. And I know that it bothered some other kids from Hawaii, and they just couldn't handle. And I think the reason why it didn't bother me was because of my experience growing up in Hawaii, where I just accepted people for really who they were and not necessarily what they look like or their last name. And I think that same mentality is carried on and helped me as an adult now that I'm back in Hawaii. And last thing I want to mention is this connection to cultural identity. And I think it's pretty unique in Hawaii. I don't know if a lot of people talk about it, because it's more just like, oh, we're the melting pot, and that's sort of the end of the discussion. But I think it goes beyond just we're the melting pot in Hawaii. I think growing up in Hawaii, you really have to figure out as a person what your cultural identity is going to be, because we really wear a lot of different identities. And I think there's a lot of different cultural identities that a person has to kind of work through to figure out which identity they identify with the most. And so you can start with your ethnicity. So for me, I'm Japanese American. So am I Japanese? Is that my cultural identity that I identify with the most? Or is it the fact that I'm from Hawaii? Is that the identity that I hold to the most? And I can say that when I went to the mainland, absolutely. I mean, that was my identity. It wasn't even that I was like Japanese, Asian, any of that. It was that, yeah, I'm from Hawaii, and I carry with that whatever that may mean for me. And now that I'm back to a certain extent, I do carry that I'm from Hawaii, since, you know, it means that you're local, right? But then it goes beyond that. It goes to sort of a national level, right? That we're all Americans. Well, for the most part, we're Americans. And where does that fall into? So you have your ethnic group, right? Japanese for me. Then you have where I'm from, which is from Hawaii. And then you have what citizenship am I a part of, which is the United States. And so I don't know, maybe people don't think about it like that, but I do think that people in Hawaii have a lot to think about when it comes to which identities they tend to stick with. So I really think that we're amazingly blessed to grow up in Hawaii, and I'm really proud that we get to raise our son in Hawaii. It's gonna be real special for him. And the fact that I also grew up in Hawaii, I think that's also special too. And I hope to do the best that I can to pass on all the things that I learned from my parents, who learned from their parents, who learned from their parents, who learned from their parents. And not just the things that we keep as a Japanese family, but also a family from Hawaii and also Americans. So please let me know what you think about growing up in Hawaii, what you loved about it, and I guess looking back, what were some of the best times? So thanks for watching, and aloha.
Hello.